I'm glad you all came out in this wind chill. Gluttons for punishment or something. There are two handouts that have gone around. The first I could have shared previous sessions, but I just stumbled upon this chart in a book on New Testament text criticism, but it might be helpful that by centuries, from the 1st to the 15th century of AD or the Common Era, sort of the evolution of what we've been talking about in terms of writing materials, going from scrolls to the Roman Codex, book form, from papyrus to parchment or vellum, and early on the use of a stylus that scribes would use to write, and that's supplanted by the quill pen. And then in terms of the Greek New Testament, or the Greek Old Testament as well, initially written in what we think of as uppercase letters of the Greek alphabet, uncials, and that finally gave way to lowercase letters, by starting in the 9th to 10th centuries. So you might find that helpful for reference purposes. The other handout on a legal size sheet will come to later, because we'll be talking about these two passages. One on one side is about section of John, and on the back side is about the ending of the Gospel of Mark. Well, the first three times we focused on the scribal craft in general, how scribes worked, and that's applicable to both the writing of the Hebrew Bible and then production of the Greek New Testament. And then the last two times we focused on Jewish scripture, the establishment of the authoritative Hebrew text, and then last week the translation of the Hebrew text into other languages for the benefit of Jewish communities who had begun to lose their facility in Hebrew but needed their scripture in Greek or in Aramaic, which had become the everyday language of Jews, certainly in Babylon and in Egypt, and to some degree even in Palestine. So today we want to end with the New Testament, the establishment of the New Testament text, the Greek New Testament, from its origins until the present day. One thing to note is that when we talk about the New Testament and the textual materials that make up the New Testament, for us it's far more manageable. It's more familiar to us in the first place, but it's more manageable because we're talking about a very, relatively narrow slice of time. And when we speak of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, we're talking about centuries. Going back to the earliest oral traditions that are well before the year 1000 BC or before the Common Era, and our reconstruction that, by the time of David and Solomon, some of those oral traditions had assumed some kind of written form. Source material that's been lost to us. We don't have it anymore. This is a scholarly reconstruction. But the stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, stories of the Exodus, Moses, time in the wilderness, and so on, those assuming some kind of written shape in the time of David and Solomon, and then another version of it, originating maybe a century later in the northern kingdom of Israel, that the northern tribes telling the story from their perspective. But those, if they were documents, we don't have them anymore. We're on safer ground to propose that sometime during the Babylonian exile, the priests who were taken into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon took those traditions, now in some kind of written form, and edited them together to form what we now know as the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And the first glimpse we have of that becoming an established text, as we talked about at our first meeting, was during the time of Ezra. Ezra the scribe, who was among the exiles who had returned to Jerusalem he was in Jerusalem by the mid-5th century, the year 450 or so BC. And so we have these glimpses of Ezra reading from the book of the law to the assembled congregation of Israel at one of the gates of the temple. Already, we're talking about a span of a half a millennium to take us from the first written expression of those traditions down to the time of Ezra. And then it's another half millennium from the time of Ezra to the time that these Jewish guardians of the text, whom we call the Masoretes, established a standardized form of the Hebrew Bible late in the 1st century of the Common Era. So on the scale of it, we're talking about a millennium or more. But the New Testament, when we talk about the time of its, the original texts, the letters of Paul or the Gospel of Mark, from the time they were written, put in print, to the time those traditions surrounding Jesus and Paul's ministry and so on, by the time they were assumed some kind of written form, we're talking about half a century. So it's a different, completely different scale when we talk about, in terms of time, when we talk about the New Testament. Packed into that half century or so, we believe that Jesus' life and ministry was in the late 3rd decade of the 1st century, that his ministry, depending on whether you read it from the perspective of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or read it from the perspective of John's Gospel, his ministry lasted either a year, that's what we infer from reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or from the perspective of John, it spanned 3 years. But concluded around the year 30 with his crucifixion and the traditions about his resurrection. From that time on, oral traditions about his ministry, about his teaching, about his miracles, about his travels, likely were in circulation not long after, but we're not yet at the point of the Gospels in their written form. The first written materials in the New Testament are the letters of Paul. And it's believed that the earliest letter, the earliest book of the New Testament, is Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, likely written around the year 50. But by the year 60, 10 years later, all of the books that we have in the New Testament that we attribute to Paul as authentic letters of Paul had been written in a decade's time, from 50 to 60. It wasn't until after that that we get our first gospel, around the year 65 or thereabouts, the Gospel of Mark. Mark is the first gospel, and what precipitated its writing was the Roman-Jewish War, when the Roman Empire did battle with the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem to put down their rebelliousness. And it was out of that critical time that sort of precipitated the writing of Mark's Gospel. Meanwhile, some of those oral traditions about Jesus' teachings began to assume some kind of written form, and so scholars have reconstructed that there was likely a written source of Jesus' teachings in circulation, by the time of Mark's Gospel. Mark didn't use those materials, but a bit later, Matthew and Luke did. Matthew and Luke write their Gospels maybe 20 years later, in the 80s, and they draw upon Mark. Mark provides the outline or the framework for both Matthew and Luke, but into that framework, Matthew and Luke draw this material from this hypothetical teaching source, written source, and we've had an example of that in the gospel readings for these last couple of Sundays. Sunday before last, you recall that we have the beginning of Jesus' sermon on the plain, or on a level place, but it's sharing material with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. But it's the same material. Matthew and Luke put it in a different setting, but it's the same material that they're drawing from this common source. Matthew and Luke, writing in the mid-80s, in addition to Mark, the framework, and this common teaching material that they're drawing upon, biblical scholars like to call that written source Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source, and it's believed it was something had been committed to writing, and it's a collection of Jesus' parables and some of these short, pithy sayings that we meet in the Gospels. In addition to that, both Matthew and Luke add to those the sayings from Q and to Mark. They add some material that has come down to them alone or uniquely. So biblical scholars talk about a special Lucan source, material that only Luke uses. Likewise, some material that's unique to Matthew, and each of those two gospel writers then plug that into their framework. Some examples would be, most familiar one would be the Christmas narratives in Luke. Shepherds keeping watch in their fields by night. I mean, that's only in Luke. And so Luke presumably has some source that's come down to him that has some infancy narratives about Jesus' early years. Matthew, it's only in Matthew that we get the story of uh, the three wise men, the wise men from Babylon, the Magi. It's only in Matthew, and so presumably that comes from a source known to Matthew or used only by Matthew himself. After the writing of Matthew and Mark, within the next 10, 15 years or so, the rest of the books of the New Testament take shape, including the Gospel of John, which is, in terms of when it was written, is the latest of the Gospels. And John, it's believed, was written by, some would say by the year 100, some would say, maybe a little later, but roughly by the year 100, along with the book of Revelation, letter to the Hebrews, and so on. So all this has happened in half a century. This just summarizes what I mentioned about this written source Matthew and Luke draw upon, and then these sources that were unique to each of those evangelists. We get some glimpses in Paul, in his letters, that his letters were written, and he had a hand in writing them to some degree. It's likely that he dictated much of what he wanted to say to these various congregations to a secretary or to a scribe, but at various points he would add his own signature, if you will, or a comment of his own. And so some interesting little passages from some of the letters, like 2 Thessalonians, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. He's doing something on his own, and this is the mark that I make in every letter of mine to sort of legitimize what he's saying, and see what large letters I make when I'm writing in my own hand. In Galatians, something similar in 1 Corinthians 16. But in Romans, we get this glimpse of a secretary or a scribe taking dictation, that Paul is dictating what he wants to say to the Romans to this scribe or secretary by the name of Tertius. So we get this glimpse on the pages of the New Testament itself that this material is being committed to writing. But the earliest copies we have of New Testament materials are fragments of papyrus, the earliest of which goes back to the first part of the 2nd century. So, sometime after the year 100, between the year 100, 150 AD, or the Common Era, we have one papyrus fragment that has 4 verses, only 4 verses, out of the 18th chapter of John. But it's been dated to, probably no later than 150. So if John's gospel itself wasn't written originally until the year 100, we've got something in writing from within 50 years of that. And we can't say that about Genesis. From the year 200, there's a papyrus with all of the Gospel of John. There are a few pieces missing, but essentially all of John is in this papyrus that goes by the identification or catalog tag of P66. Another papyrus known as P46 has considerable number of pages of Paul's letters that are known from from the year 200 or thereabouts. Not long after, 30 leaves or pages with sections of Matthew, Luke, and the book of Acts, along with fragments of Matthew and John. So this is a slide of part of the 16th chapter of Luke from a papyrus that dates to the early 3rd century, in other words, to the early 200s AD, written in Greek uppercase letters or uncials. But alongside the papyrus witnesses, the earliest witnesses that we have on papyrus fragments, papyrus texts, we have the emergence of these Greek codices, biblical text in book form. And we've talked about these in past weeks. These three most famous ones are from the 4th century and 5th century. One found at Mount Sinai, or at the monastery at the base of Mount Sinai, so-called Codex Sinaiticus, dating from the 300s, that has both material from the Old and New Testaments, as well as the Apocrypha. Likewise, Codex Vaticanus from about the same time, so named because it's housed in the Vatican Library. And from a little later, the Codex Alexandrinus, so named because it was in the Patriarchal Library in Alexandria in Egypt. When we talk about New Testament material, what's interesting about a couple of these is that Sinaiticus, for example, has the Old Testament. We talked about that before, and books of the Apocrypha. It has the New Testament as we know it, but in addition to the New Testament, it has a couple of other books. One book known as the Epistle of Barnabas, another known as the the Shepherd of Hermas. Both these are sort of lumped together with New Testament materials because they come from that period. But you could express it that these are books that did not make the cut when it came to establishing the limits of the New Testament. Limiting the New Testament to the 27 books we think of was a decision that was finally made or agreed upon sometime in the 4th century. Up until that time, the limits of the New Testament were kind of fluid. And so some of these other books get listed along with New Testament books. The Epistle of Barnabas, for example, Barnabas was a Jewish Christian, a companion of Paul, went with Paul on a mission to Cyprus and Western Asia Minor. And in this book, Barnabas tries to give spiritual interpretations of Jewish institutions. In other words, Sabbath, temple, and Jewish festivals, to spiritualize those Jewish festivals for a Christian audience. Alexandrinus, similarly, has the New Testament along with the two letters of Clement. Clement was a Roman Christian, and he's writing two letters to Corinth, and Paul is sort of his model. I mean, just as Paul wrote to Corinth, Clement writes to Corinth to deal with issues that pertain to that congregation, that there was some conflict or controversy about leadership in the congregation in Corinth. Paul had done that. I mean, part of what he had addressed in writing to the Corinthians, and so Clement does it as well. And these books date from very late in the 1st century or early 2nd century. And so in this one codex, Alexandrinus, the letters of Clement, get tossed in with the New Testament in that codex. This is the very end of the Gospel of Luke from Codex Sinaiticus. And so the colophon at the very end of the book, down here it says, Euangelion, gospel, Euangelion, the same word where we get, evangelist or evangelism. The gospel, kata Lukan, the gospel kata according to Lukan, according to Luke. In this 4th century codex, the Gospel of Luke, written in Greek uppercase letters, one of our principal sources for recovering the New Testament. From the time of those codices, 4th, 5th century and thereabouts, as we move into the latter part of that first millennium, the writing of Scripture went from being written in uppercase Greek letters to lowercase, or what are called minuscules. There was a practical advantage to this. You can write minuscule text quicker, you can write it faster than writing in capitals, and you can put more on a page. And relative to the number of codices that we have access to, like Sinaiticus or Alexandrinus or Vaticanus, relative to the, to the somewhat limited number of those great codices, there are far more minuscule Greek manuscripts that we have available as witnesses to the text. So this is an example of a minuscule containing some sections from both Luke and John, and just by looking at it, you can get a feel for, a scribe could do this pretty fast. In addition to the kind of painstaking work it would take, to write a text in uppercase letters. Here's another one, very beginning of Luke's gospel. Interesting thing about this, on the page, the left-hand side of the page is in Greek, the Greek minuscule of Luke 1. The right-hand side is in Latin. So you've got this, side by side, you've got this text in both languages. So for example, up here at the very beginning, in capital letters, Lukan, Luke, and then Kephalion Alpha, Kephalion, chapter, chapter Alpha, chapter 1. So the very beginning of Luke's gospel. Last week we talked about how the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, eventually came to be translated into other ancient languages for the benefit of a larger Jewish audience. Same is true with the New Testament, that it found its way into other languages of the Eastern Mediterranean basin, essentially the same languages that the Old Testament came to be translated into as well. The first of these is interesting. This is the work of Tatian, about the year 170. Tatian was a Christian who prepared a harmony of the four Gospels. So by Tatian's time, he has access to the four Gospels, and he thinks it would be good to harmonize them, to bring them all together. And so he comes up with this edition of the Gospel, drawing upon Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, weaving all that material together. And so the name given to that is diatessaron, which in Greek simply means, through the three. In other words, his work comes through the work of through the work of the four gospel writers. We only have some snippets of that in Greek. We have more of it as it was translated into the Syriac language. The New Testament found its way fairly early into Syriac, starting with the Gospels. The book by Janet Soskis on the Sisters of Sinai, you'll recall that this key part of that story is how these two Victorian-era travelers, widows from Scotland, Presbyterians, found in the monastery at St. Catherine's at the base of the Mount Sinai this text in Syriac. On the surface, it was some stories of early Christian martyrs written in Syriac, but beneath that originally had been written, the four Gospels, and they're credited with finding that material and making that available to a wider academic audience. There emerged an authoritative Syriac version of the New Testament, as was true of the Old Testament. The name in Syriac given to it is the Peshitta, which means simple or common or everyday version of the Scripture. And I'll send this around, but this is the New Testament written in Syriac. And that goes back to probably the late 4th century AD. For the Christian West, Christians particularly in North Africa, in Italy, around the Western Mediterranean, there was a need to put Scripture into Latin. There had been some old Latin translations done fairly early, but it was St. Jerome, also in the late 4th century, who produces what became the authoritative Latin translation of the Bible, both Old and New Testaments. The translation that we know as the Vulgate. Here again, the word Vulgate meaning vulgar or common, everyday, just as it's the equivalent word to Peshitta in Syriac. I mean, this was meant to be the everyday accessible version of Scripture, that it would be available to Christians who spoke those respective languages. Also, other early translations, just as there had been of the Old Testament, into other languages of the region, the Coptic language in Egypt, the language of ancient Abyssinia or Ethiopia, and also ancient Armenia. As the years went by, there was felt the need for, we've got all of these textual witnesses, we've got all these manuscripts, the great Greek codices, we got all of these minuscule manuscripts numbering in the hundreds, We've got these, papyrus materials. We've got this vast array of textual materials. They're not necessarily in agreement. If you compare and contrast stories in them, they're not always in agreement. Out of this diverse material, is it possible for us to standardize or come up with a standardized or accepted text that is the most probable form of the original? So in part, what precipitated the movement to come up with a standardized text was the printing press. So Gutenberg and movable type, in part, can be credited, to the establishment of a standardized form of the Greek New Testament. The first printed text of the New Testament was sponsored by the Catholic Cardinal of Ajala in Spain, Cardinal Ximenes, who in 1514 sponsored a translation of the Greek New Testament and sponsored the printing of a standardized text of the Greek New Testament. In other words, by comparing and contrasting manuscripts, bringing them together in coming up with a text that could be printed. To that, in the following years, he added the Old Testament. In doing that, not only was he drawing upon Greek material, but he says, well, let's include with this, the Bible in other languages as well. And so the end product was in a printed Bible called a polyglot. In other words, the Bible out of, with many languages, sort of side by side so they could be contrasted and compared. About the same time, in the Netherlands, the Dutch humanist Erasmus set upon the task of doing something similar, that drawing upon the manuscripts known to him, Greek manuscripts, he, out of that, pulled together and edited a Greek text of the New Testament that he thought would be the most probable reading that could be pulled together out of these various witnesses. It's the Greek text of Erasmus, which was published 1515, 1516. It was Erasmus's Greek New Testament is the form of the New Testament that Luther used when he did his German translation of the New Testament a few years later. That process continued in the years that follow, that a colleague of John Calvin's, around the year 1600, half century or so later than Erasmus, he too set upon the task of comparing and contrasting known Greek manuscripts to see if he could come up with a standardized text, a most probable form of the Greek text. So he used manuscript material known to him. He did comparison with the Vulgate, with Syriac, and he's credited with his efforts resulted in an emerging standardized text as well. And so from the initial work done by Erasmus and Theodore Beza and others, until this day, there's been an ongoing effort to keep at the task of arriving at a standardized or most probable form of the Greek New Testament. And so today, the Greek New Testament that is used by biblical scholars, or the one that seminary students work with. Some of them like to do this. Some seminary students rebel at the very idea, but these are products of this process. Most of the hard work on putting together a standardized text was done in the United Kingdom and in Germany. And today there's an entity known as the United Bible Societies, which is a consortium of a number of Bible societies in various countries who continue to work on this task. And so I'll pass these around. This is the New Testament in Greek, and then on the facing page is an English translation. But this is represent the most recent product of this process of working on a Greek New Testament text, the text of the United Bible Societies. And a fellow credited with heading this up is a German by the name of Kurt Aland, A-L-A-N-D. Prior to him, another standardized text was a product, a similar process, and the principal person involved in this was a fellow by the name of Eberhard Nestle, another German. And so here there's the Nestle Greek text, and on the facing page is, for comparative value, is the New Testament in Latin in Jerome's Vulgate. This text, these standardized texts that are used by translators, biblical scholars, as they do this, they come up with what they think is the most probable or most likely form of the text. But as these Greek New Testaments are going around, at the bottom of the page, you'll see in small print a series of footnotes or notations. And so the editors are calling to our attention, variations in the text. What's on the most of the page, this is what the committee thinks is the most probable form of this passage. But they want the reader to be aware of, well, there are other witnesses of the text in antiquity that read something else. And so the footnotes are there for our to make us aware of what these variants are. And so let's look at some examples. For example, Luke 11:2, which is in Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer. We've got the most familiar form of the Lord's Prayer to us is the one we use devotionally or liturgically, and that's the one from Matthew's Gospel. But Luke also has the same prayer, and presumably Luke and Matthew both are drawing it from that sort of common source of teachings that emerged probably in the by the years 50 or thereabouts. In Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer, it begins with, "Father, hallowed be your name." But we're familiar with, Matthew is more familiar, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. But if you were to look at the fine print at the bottom of the page, in one of these testaments going around, of the text of Luke 11, the notation at the bottom would footnote, well, at 11:2, there are some readings in manuscripts of Luke that read, Our Father in heaven. In other words, they're reading it as, in the same way that we meet it in the Gospel of Matthew. So the assumption is that these witnesses, these manuscripts, changed the text, amended the text that originally simply said, Father. They changed it to read, Our Father, under the influence of that more familiar version from Matthew. So they were influenced by liturgical practice or devotional practice, because it's the Matthean form of the text is the one more familiar to us. So the editors of the proposing a standardized text say, no, Luke 11:2 read simply Father. Father, hallowed be your name. And so in this, we see evidence of a kind of one of the basic principles that textual critics work with, is that the shorter reading is the preferred reading. Because the tendency of scribes would be to expand or to add rather than to take away. So the assumption is that whoever produced the manuscript of Luke that read Our Father added that because he had been influenced by the familiarity of the phrase from Matthew, and so he just expanded the original of Luke from Father to Our Father. Another example would be at the very close of Luke's Gospel, after the resurrection, after Luke's account of the ascension, it says that the disciples worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple blessing God. But some texts of Luke 24 read it or write that they were continually in the temple blessing and praising God. But the word used for praise here, praising, in the all 24 chapters of Luke, that word to praise, the distinctive word for to praise, only occurs 3 times. So it's a rare term in Luke. But here it shows up in Luke 24. So that caught the attention of the editors, that term is not really that characteristic of Luke. And so the assumption is that simply saying that they were in the temple blessing God was the original reading, and that praising was added under some external influence because of the coupling of those phrases, coupling of those verbs, blessing and praising, from some other source. So here again, an example of the shorter reading being the preferred reading because of the tendency of scribes to add or to conflate readings. Now, that one handout that went around on the legal size pad, legal size sheet. You could take that out. The very end of Mark had some textual problems. When we read the Easter account in Mark, chapter 16, it ends at verse 8 with the women fleeing from the empty tomb. And the last words in verse 8 are, and they were afraid. And that's it. Well, at some point, somebody was uncomfortable with leaving Mark's gospel end at that point. Well, on the note of fear. So along the way somewhere, there were some additional there's some endings proposed for the Gospel of Mark. One of those is that there's a verse added after verse 8 that scholars call the shorter ending to Mark, that says that the women went and told Peter what they had been commanded by Jesus to Peter and his those associating with him, and that Peter and his company then went out to proclaim the gospel from east to west. But then there's a longer ending that had been added to Mark in some manuscripts, which talks about Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, and then he appears in another form to two of them as they were walking into the country. And then he appeared to the 11, and he tells them, go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. Those sound familiar, because we've heard those in the other Gospels. So Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. Well, that's the end of John's Gospel. He appears to two of them walking in the country. Well, that's the story of Jesus encountering the two on the road to Emmaus. Well, where's that? That's in Luke's Gospel. And then to the 11, he says to them, go into the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. Well, that sounds very much like the end of Matthew's Gospel, the Great Commission. So the assumption is, on the basis of critics, that this longer ending of Mark's Gospel is a collage, if you will, of stuff they've drawn from these other Gospels. So this is, was something done later and added to Mark to make Mark end on a more positive note, if you will, that rather than leaving Mark ending the women left the tomb afraid, well, look what happened after that, drawing upon other Gospels who were in circulation. Now, what's interesting is how that's been translated in English versions over the years. In the King James Version, the authorized version of 1611, you look at chapter 16, and it's all there. Right after verse 8 comes verse 9, all the way up to 20. All that material is included, and at first glance, it looks like it's integral to all of Mark's Gospel. The only hint you get that the translators or editors of the King James Version knew that there was some problem with this ending is indicated by the little, if you look closely, by that sign in the margin. I think the name for that is Pilcrow, the paragraph marker. That for those in the know, that should catch your attention. Well, this is marking a section that wasn't integral to the text as a whole. But to the average reader, we probably wouldn't catch that. In the Revised Standard Version of 1946, there the editors recognized that this is later material, added later, and so in a fine print at the bottom of the page, in a footnote, they say other texts and versions add as 16:9 to 20 the following passage, and it gives us the text in these italicized texts. But the interesting thing about the new Revised Standard Version of 1989 is that now they made it explicit for us. They call our attention to, there are these two shorter endings, two endings of Mark that were not part of the original. One is shorter, one is longer, and so they break those out separately to bring those to our attention. And they add some other commentary as well as a footnote at the bottom of the right-hand column. If we go back in antiquity, that longer ending, verses 9 through 20, appears in some manuscripts, ancient manuscripts. This Codex Alexandrinus, the one from Alexandria in Egypt, has it. But the Codex Sinaiticus, as well as the one in the Vatican Library, don't have it. So in these ancient codices, there was a distinction made between, is this integral to the Gospel of Mark or not? So just to repeat what I said a moment ago, the assumption now is that that longer edition is from the 2nd century, and it's this digest or put together, or collage put together of other resurrection traditions drawn from the other Gospels and the book of Acts in terms of the ascension story in the opening of the book of Acts. Jerome in his Vulgate retained that longer ending, making no distinction that it was different from, that there was any difference as you went from verse 8 to verse 9. So the fact that Jerome included that in his Vulgate was probably an influence on the translators of the King James Bible, as well as Luther when he translated the New Testament, to keep that longer ending as a part of Mark's Gospel. If you flip that sheet over, another problem over the years has been this the story of the woman taken in adultery in John's Gospel. It begins at the very end of chapter 7, goes through the first 12 verses of chapter 8. Here again in the King James Version, it's there. And as you look at the page, it looks like it's integral to John. In the Revised Standard Version of 1946, though, as you go down the column of chapter 7, you come to verse 52. They replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Search and you will see that no prophet is to rise from Galilee." And then look what's next, chapter 8, but not chapter 8, verse 1. It says chapter 8, verse 12. So something's missing. And so the RSV editors have moved that text to the bottom of the page, put it in small print, and so we get the story of the woman taken in adultery relegated to this footnote. The NRSV keeps it in the column of text in the same typeface and size as the rest of the text, but you notice that they bracket it off and add a footnote saying that the most ancient authorities lack 753 through 811. Other authorities add the passage here or after 736, or after 2125, or after Luke 21:38. What's believed is the story about the woman taken in adultery. It's believed that this is authentic. I mean, this is part of the received tradition about Jesus, but it's kind of a floating story that was out there, and it got plugged in at different places in the gospel tradition. And so in John, it ended up, right at the end of chapter 7, and became, also the first 11 verses of chapter 8, for no particular reason. But what's interesting is that it shows up in some ancient manuscripts plugged in to the Gospel of Luke. And if you read the place at which it's put in Luke, it makes more sense. Because in Luke, at the very end of chapter 21, Jesus is teaching in the temple. The Mount of Olives is mentioned, that he's gone out to the Mount of Olives withdrawn to the Mount of Olives to rest, and that he comes back to the temple to teach. And you read this section, the story of the woman taken in adultery, and it mentions the Mount of Olives. It mentions Jesus teaching in the temple. And so just, those two references, that Jesus teaching in the temple, the Mount of Olives, become catchwords, so that somebody editing Luke at one point in antiquity thought, oh, this text would fit nicely into that point. So it's a passage that's has puzzled biblical scholars over the years. An authentic part of the tradition, but where to put it? It's omitted in some early manuscripts, including that Papyrus, one from 200, that has essentially all of John. So it's not in the John of that Papyrus witness. It wasn't inserted there. But it does appear in John in this other codex called Codex Bezae. Also shows up in some old Latin manuscripts of John. But it has this quality to it that reads, makes it seemingly fit nicely in Luke. And geographically, in the early church, it's a text that was read and used and referred to in the Christian West. Augustine and St. Ambrose of Rome regarded it as scripture. As mentioned earlier, Jerome included this story in the Vulgate of John, but it's absent in New Testament texts of the Christian East. In Byzantine texts. We don't find it in texts of John from the East. There's one codex where it shows up, Codex Bezae, is interesting in that it has the four Gospels, but in a different order than we're accustomed to seeing them. Matthew, John, Luke, Mark is the order. It dates to about the year 400. What's interesting about it, it is written in the East, in what would now be Beirut, Lebanon, but it made its way to the West, to Lyon in France, and was revised in the West, and it came into the hands of the reformer Theodore Beza, from which it gets its name, Codex Bezae. So this is curious that it shows up in this codex that ultimately has an Eastern origin, but the story is simply not found in any other editions of John from the Christian East, from Byzantium. This is a page from Codex Bezae that I just mentioned. Well, so where have we come these last four Tuesday evenings? We began with talking about the scribal craft, starting with Ezra and Sirach, who praises the work of the scribe and likely considers himself one of their company. We spent a little time talking about the copyists in the Qumran community at the Dead Sea, and then to the scribal efforts of the Jewish Masoretes in Tiberias, in Palestine, who are the ones responsible for establishing the authoritative Hebrew text of Jewish scripture. And it was largely Christian monastics that assumed that responsibility in the Christian community for not only the Old Testament, but now with the emergence of the New Testament, copying and transmitting those materials from generation to generation. We spent a little time talking about the variety of writing materials, papyrus and parchment or vellum, use of scrolls and then codices, the scripture in book form as we think of it today. When we talked about the Hebrew Bible, we mentioned the work, the findings at the Dead Sea and the Qumran caves. Our earliest witnesses that we can touch and feel and see of the Hebrew Bible that date from as early as the 2nd century before the Common Era down to the time that the Romans destroyed that community late in the 1st century A.D. And the work of the Masoretes, these scripture scholars based in Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, another Masoretic community among the Jews in Babylon that are credited with transmitting and establishing the authoritative text of Hebrew Scripture. And then translations of Hebrew Scripture in other languages. And today, out of that has, we have this Leningrad Codex has become the standard text for study and use in both Judaism and Christianity of the Hebrew Bible, dating from the year 1008. And then the Aleppo Codex, that was the subject of one of the books that we talked about that some of you have read already, dating from about a century earlier, about the year 930, that likely is a superior text, but we don't have all of it. We're missing, Genesis through part of Deuteronomy, but the rest of the Hebrew Bible exists in that codex. And then this evening, we've explored a little bit about the Greek text in the New Testament, its early witnesses, and the process of biblical scholars, since the time of the Reformation and Renaissance, working on establishing, the most probable form of an original Hebrew text. In other words, as close to the original Hebrew as we think we can get. As close to the original Greek form of the New Testament that we think we can get. So I hope you found this interesting. I find it fascinating, but I commend to you again those books that were on the reading list. Some of you have read one or more of them already, but they're all accessible and enjoyable reads and informative. So with that, I'd be happy to respond to any questions, and we'll call it an evening. Yes, Carla?
A simple-minded question, which is, were all the Gospels written in Greek?
Yes.
Okay. So nothing was written in Aramaic
The New Testament was completely written in Greek, because even though someone like Matthew, who's a Jew, Mark as well, John, Luke is a Gentile, but the others are all Jews. But by then, the Jewish community, they were fully thoroughly Hellenized. Greek was their everyday language, and and even when they quote Scripture, and they quote the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament, they're quoting it in its Greek translation, in the Septuagint, and Paul as well. Paul prides himself as being a Pharisee, trained by one of the great rabbis of the era. He would have known Hebrew, but he's writing his letters, or dictating his letters, in the Greek language.
Isn't the everyday language, though, the marketplace language, Aramaic?
The Greek, the term given name, the Greek spoken then, were used in Palestine and around the Mediterranean. Goes by the name of koine, which means common or everyday, just like Jerome's Latin is vulgar Latin. It's the language of the marketplace, everyday language people spoke.
So Jesus' language wasn't Aramaic?
Oh, Jesus.
Jesus and yeah.
Well, excuse me. Jesus and his disciples, circle of disciples, presumably were speaking and using Aramaic. But when it came to collecting and writing down traditions about Jesus and his sayings, the written form of those was not in Aramaic, but they were collected in Greek. And so that we talk about that hypothetical source of Jesus' sayings that are shared by Matthew and Luke, assuming that was a written document, and that would have been in Greek. Yeah, Bob.
Do you think the likelihood of some more ancient manuscripts being discovered around the 11th, 12th century or before?
Oh, it's always possible. In other words, you're still, who knows what's in a monastery library someplace. And I used the example 2 weeks ago of the discovery of these texts from this texts that were found in this Geniza, or the storeroom in Cairo in the synagogue, medieval Jewish manuscripts. But and the likelihood that those manuscripts were themselves copied from manuscripts found in caves. The letter of these two, of one Syriac bishop to the other, says, "It's come to my attention that in some caves near Jericho, a shepherd, a Bedouin shepherd, found some manuscripts in Hebrew, and it reads like the story from 1947, that finding the Dead Sea Scrolls. So who knows what's out there? That there's some, maybe some cave yet to be located, and some treasure in that we still yet to be found, or some monastery library that hasn't been explored in a good many centuries, and if somebody would just go and rummage around, who knows what he or she might find.
What were burial practices like, and were texts ever buried?
Where?
What were burial practices like, and were texts ever buried in tombs that were then discovered? Is that a common thing for scriptural texts to be buried?
Oh. Those in medieval Judaism, when sacred texts could no longer be used, they're too fragile. Scrolls, for example, they were used in liturgy of the synagogue, and over the years, as they were unrolled and rolled up again, and parchment becomes fragile and brittle, and they can't be used. Some of those found their ways to these storerooms or genizas in synagogues, but there was also a practice of burying them. That they would simply, physically bury these texts as if they were buried in a cemetery. It was, this was sacred text. You just didn't throw it away, but it was either stored it in one of these rooms, or you gave it a reverent burial if it. Well, are you ready to brave the wind chill?
Tom, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.